Hey guys, thanks for joining us today for our study in toxic masculinity and our look into the life of King David. Now, I want you to know that the video you're about to watch was shot a little over a year ago. When this material came to light, when the Holy Spirit put it to us, we really knew we had to go ahead and shoot this. We had to go ahead and capture it. We didn't know when we would release it. We're convinced this is the right time to release this. We've just prayed it through and we believe that God has something for you here. Yes, I look different in the video, but we shot this when God gave it to us, and now we're going to put it out there because we believe this is when He told us to.
Hey y'all, well thanks again for joining us as we are studying through the life of King David, and we're looking specifically at how one achieves a non-toxic masculinity. Again, the world's kind of coming against maleness these days, seeing it as dangerous, and honestly, any attitude from anybody is dangerous, but yes, masculinity can be a toxic thing if it's not governed by the power of the Holy Spirit. Listen, the Holy Spirit can take anything and sanctify it and make it useful and make it powerful. And when we are learning to be men, the way the Holy Spirit has called us to be men, that's a powerful thing. So that's what we want to talk about. There will also be lessons in here for all the ladies out there, so don't feel like you're being left out either. What we're looking at is the life of King David. And if you'll remember when we talked a couple of weeks ago, I talked about the fact that King David as a young man was a shepherd. So he spent a great deal of time out in the fields taking care of the sheep. Here's what I want you to understand. In ancient Israel, in ancient times, being a shepherd was considered one of the best training grounds for being a king. In fact, most kings, people wanted them to have been a shepherd at some point. Why? Because as a shepherd, there had to be tons of quiet time so that you could think and make wise choices. There had to be a taking care of a group of animals, a group of living beings that couldn't take care of themselves. So there had to be compassion there. There had to be bravery there, because there were times when things threatened the flock and you have to fight off those things that threaten the flock. So learning bravery as a shepherd is the one I want to focus on this time. And listen, why do you learn bravery as a shepherd? Well, the truth is there's a few reasons. You're alone, so you have plenty of time to think through what you would do in a crisis moment. You do have things, and wild animals, other poachers that attempt to come in and harm the flock or steal the flock or kill sheep from within the flock. You've got to defend against those. You have to actually act with courage and bravery at times. But you learn over time how to do this. And listen, you learn how to do this on your own, because a lot of times shepherds are in the fields protecting their flocks by themselves. So when David spent this time younger in this place, he learned a lot of things. Here's what I want us to do as we look at this. I want us to understand that there are also times that you need to get out into nature, away from all of the distractions, and remind yourself of these things. Why? Because that perspective you learned in your youth will be important as you go forward, because every leader faces giant problems. Now, David faced a giant problem early on in his life. He was already anointed to be the next king of Israel. And Israel is fighting the Philistines. And as they're fighting the Philistines, the Philistines decide that what they're going to do is send out their champion. Their champion is named Goliath. Now, y'all, listen. Bible says the dude's about 9 feet tall. I don't know what that actually comes out to, because these are ancient measurements that are not meant to be specific or not meant to be precise. But this is a big dude. So big, in fact, that all of Israel's army is cowering. Because what the Philistines have said is, we're going to send out our best champion. You send out your best champion. And what we're going to do is we're going to decide who wins this battle, not by fighting each other and a bunch of people dying, but by two guys fighting, and whoever wins. If the Philistines guy wins, then all of the Israels have to be the slaves of the Philistines. If the Israelites guy wins, all the Philistines become slaves of the Israelites. Okay, they send out Goliath. This giant of a man walks out. He's got a sword bigger than most of the guys on the other side. He's got this huge shield. He's got this armor bearer with him. He's got all of this going on. He's just, if you can imagine this giant of a man walking out on the battlefield, and the sun's just shining off of all of his weapons and his armor, and he starts to defy the Israelites. He starts to, I dare you guys, send somebody out to fight me. And he starts to curse the God of Israel. This is where it gets real. when he curses the God of Israel, these men in the army, these men in Israel's army need to be prepared to defend the name of their God, but they're not. They're all afraid. They're all shaking in their boots. Well, okay, pause. Meanwhile, back at the farm, David is still watching sheep until his dad calls him in. And his dad says, David, take all of these supplies and go down to the front line where the army of Israel is fighting the Philistines. So David shows up just as Goliath is shouting out these curses, this disrespectfulness to the armies of Israel and to the God of Israel. David looks at it and he can't figure this out. Why are all the men cowering? Why are they shaking in their boots? Why is nobody challenging this Philistine, this guy? Now watch. David looks at Goliath and he does not see him the same way that the people in the army are seeing him. Listen to me. David looks at Goliath and he sees nothing more than the threats he's already fought off against his sheep already. He sees Goliath as a problem that can be dealt with, not as something, a giant that can't be defeated. Listen to what he says. David says to Saul, he goes to Saul, he says, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go up and fight him. In other words, David says, I'll go get him. Saul, y'all, I see y'all are scared. I see y'all don't know what to do. Listen, don't worry. I got this. And so David says he's going to go get Goliath. This freaks everybody out. Well, why does David think this way? They've got to be asking this. Who does David think he is? What does David think he's going to do? This little kid's going to go fight that giant? Listen, when you face a giant problem, it will require that you have the right perspective. David looks at this and he sees nothing in the world but another threat to God's people, another threat to the flock that he has to take care of. Remember, David is already thinking in terms of he's going to be king of Israel. He's already viewing the people of Israel and the armies of Israel as his sheep, as his flock, as something and someone he has to take care of. He's already thinking that way. And since he's thinking that way, he looks at Goliath and he sees nothing more than a wolf that's coming after his sheep. And so he says, well, God protected me before, God will protect me now. His perspective makes Goliath, watch. His perspective makes Goliath seem so much smaller than Goliath actually is. Listen, when you look at a problem from the perspective of God called me to this, so God's going to do this with me, the problem gets smaller. But when you look at a problem from the standpoint of, I've got to do this, and you don't think of God helping you, the problem gets bigger. So for the army of Israel, who's looking at Goliath thinking they've got to do it on their own, and they don't think of God's going to help them, Goliath is a bigger threat than he actually is. From the perspective of a David who's looking at this from the standpoint of, my God is going to protect me, Goliath becomes smaller than he actually is. Now listen, I'm being honest. I actually think David saw Goliath as less of a threat than Goliath may have actually been. However, when David sees it from God's perspective, David sees it from the right perspective. Now, a giant problem requires the right perspective, but it also requires that I've had the right practices in my background. As David responds to Saul when Saul says, you can't do this, David said, well, yes, I can. Listen to his words, chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, verse 36. Listen to his words. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God. David does not say, because I'm so awesome, because I'm so strong, because I'm so big, he's in trouble. David says because he came against God, he's going to lose. And he's going to be just like every threat I've faced everywhere else I've been. Hey, King, I've seen things like this before. It's ridiculous to think that this little boy could defeat a bear, but it happened. It's ridiculous to think that this little boy could defeat a lion, but it's happened. It's ridiculous to think that this little boy could protect an entire flock of sheep, but it's happened. And since it's happened before, I now know exactly how to deal with this situation. Look, David is saying, look, I've done this before. This is nothing new. You know what? Sometimes it's very interesting in David's world that he's young and he sees things this way. Quite often you have to get some age on you. You got to get some miles on you before you can think like this. Because older people, when they face problems like this, they just say, oh, okay. And they know how to deal with it because they've already been there. But David's already at that place in his life. He's already fought things that should kill him, and he's won. He knows God can see him through it. He's had the practice already to get this done. David can face this one giant problem because he's had the right practice. Now listen, he also understands something else. David said to Goliath, he's already headed out on the field. Listen, Saul says you can't do this. David says I can. Saul says, okay, let me put the armor on you. So he puts Saul's own armor on David. Too big for him, doesn't fit. He says, I can't wear this. David says, I'm going to do this the way God told me to do this. I'm going to do this the way God showed me to do this. And David shows up. He walks out on that battlefield with just himself, a sling, and 5 smooth stones. He put 1 stone in the sling and starts walking out on the field. Goliath starts yelling at him. It's very interesting. Goliath can't hardly see him, says, come closer so I can see you. Goliath has somebody around him at all times leading him. And Goliath, when he realizes that David is just a boy, he says to him, am I a dog that you send a boy after me? Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? What in the world? What is this? You send to me a little boy with a staff and a sling in his hand? And Goliath is like, this is going to be easy. Look, when you face this one giant problem, and you've got the right perspective because you're looking at it from God's lens, and you've got the right practice because you've already seen God deal with it before, you've got to listen to what God has told you to do and done in you before, and take the right approach. Because look, the world has a way they want to do it, but it's not God's way. Saul wanted David to go out there with armor on and a big sword and go fight that Goliath the way everybody else fights. David said, no, I'm going to take my sling. Goliath looks at David, can't hardly see him from a distance, looks at David and says, you're just a boy with a sling. What are you going to do to me? But David knows something they don't know. Look, in modern times, they've taken these slings like David used, and they've found the most skillful people to use them. And they've measured the velocity of this stone when it comes out of this sling and it moves forward. Listen to me. What David knew that they didn't was the velocity of that stone, the speed of that stone when it left his sling was going to be similar to what we today would see as the speed, the velocity, and the impact of a firearm, of a gun. Here's what none of them understand. Saul wants David to go out there with a knife. David says, I got a gun. Goliath shows up with a knife to a gunfight, and David knows it. But Goliath doesn't get it. Saul doesn't get it. None of them get it. You know why they don't get it? Because they're thinking of this in their terms. They're thinking of this the way they have fought. They are thinking of this in human terms. David is listening to God, and God's ideas always put the odds in your favor. God's ideas always give you the moment where God is not going to allow this, I'll use his words, uncircumcised Philistine to defeat or defile the armies of God or defy any longer the name of the God of heaven. Now, because David has listened to God in the quiet times, because David has seen God deliver in the quiet times, David now faces this giant problem, but he doesn't see a giant. He just sees another bear. He just sees another lion, and he knows God's delivered him from those things before. Now Goliath will be no different. David understands that. Listen to me. In your life, in my life, we face giant problems all the time. But if in those moments when the stress is high and the threat is high and we don't even know whether we can make it or not, when it looks to all the world like we're done, if in those moments in our minds for even a moment we can find ourselves back here in this quiet place, in this place where we can actually hear the voice of God. You may not be able to physically go to your quiet place, but in your mind, go there and hear from the voice of God in that moment. God giving you direction. God giving you, watch, perspective. I got this. God giving you the memory of the practice. I showed you how to do this. And God showing you the right approach. I've given you the tools. And when we take that approach, our giant problem becomes nothing more than a giant opportunity for a massive victory.
Thanks for watching another episode of Midweek at your house. So what now? There's a whole community with our virtual church whose purpose is to love God and love people better every day. We would love to have you jump into that. Tune in this weekend right here on our YouTube channel for New Life at your house. There are 2 services at 9 and 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time where you can know God better through music, teaching, and more opportunities. Don't forget to subscribe and turn those notifications on. We'll see you soon.